Faithfully delivering value, interpreting great books from around the world. Hello, this is Sally's Book Club. Last time, I covered the first volume of Postwar, A History of Europe Since 1945, by British historian Tony Jett. Today we'll explore the second volume, Prosperity and Revolution, covering 1953 to 1971. First, let's briefly recap Volume 1. Post-war Europe was in ruins. While rebuilding economies and lives, the continent split into opposing blocs due to the US-Soviet Cold War. The political, economic, and cultural divide between West and East was so profound that Europe remained under war's shadow, with widespread fear of World War III plunging the continent back into chaos. In hindsight, those fears proved unnecessary. Europe avoided war and instead entered an era of economic boom and social transformation. But for people living through it, the future was unpredictable. Nobody anticipated such dramatic changes. So why did Europe's fortunes turn? And how did Western and Eastern Europe's development paths diverge? Volume 2 of Post-War Europe addresses these questions. I'll break this book down into 4 sections. The first, Part 1, Establishing Peaceful Order and Dismantling Colonial Systems. Part 2, From Western Europe's Prosperity to Welfare States. Part 3, Successes and Failures of Eastern Europe's Reforms. Part 4, The Revolutionary Storm Ignited by the Younger Generation. Now let's dive into Part 1, Establishing Peaceful Order and Dismantling Colonial Systems. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, Europe was already starkly divided. The Soviet bloc on one side
and NATO-led Western nations on the other. Tensions escalated dangerously, especially as Western powers feared East Germany might invade West Germany, potentially triggering World War III. 12 franchise bar.
Anxiety blanketed the entire continent, but history thrives on surprises. In March 1953, Soviet leader Stalin died. Khrushchev became first secretary of the Communist Party. That July, the Korean armistice ended East-West military confrontation. Shortly after, the USSR released about 5 million Gulag prisoners, signaling intentions to ease tensions domestically and abroad. Diplomatically, Khrushchev declared World War III avoidable, proposing the Three Pieces Doctrine: peaceful coexistence, peaceful competition, and peaceful transition to communism between blocs, marking a major Soviet foreign policy shift. He wouldn't start wars to impose his system, which relieved Western nations. World War was off the table. Of course, the Soviet unilateral promise alone couldn't put Western nations at ease. Establishing peaceful order depended on 2 key elements: power balance and strategic buffer zones. First, power balance. In October 1954, the US, UK, and France ended their occupation of West Germany, allowing it to rebuild an army under 500,000 troops and join NATO. This leveraged West Germany against the Soviet bloc. The USSR swiftly responded by forming the Warsaw Pact with Eastern Europe and East Germany, creating the NATO-Warsaw Pact standoff. Didn't this escalate tensions? Actually, no. Both sides were actually defining boundaries through their spheres of influence to prevent accidental conflicts. Nuclear deployments further reduced war probability. By mid-1950s, the US had 2,000 warheads and B-52 bombers capable of nuclear strikes on the USSR. Britain and France developed nukes too, while the Soviets produced about 1,700 warheads. Though insufficient to threaten the US mainland, they could menace Western Europe. Since both sides could destroy each other, neither dared strike first, achieving nuclear balance. Now, strategic buffer zones. In May 1955, the US, UK, France, and USSR signed the Austrian State Treaty establishing neutral Austria, occupied since WAC, requiring it to join neither bloc. Troops then withdrew. Neighboring Yugoslavia practiced socialism but rejected Soviet dominance. In 1953, Yugoslavia signed the Balkan Pact for military cooperation with Greece and Turkey. Yugoslav leader Tito co-founded the non-aligned movement with Egypt's Nasser and India's Nehru, advocating independent development for smaller nations without major power alignment, making Yugoslavia another NATO Warsaw buffer. But one gap remained unsealed: Berlin. In 1949, Germany split into West and East Germany, with East Germany controlling East Berlin and West Germany holding West Berlin, dividing the city. East and West Berlin were nominally sealed off with restricted movement, but as one interconnected city, their transport networks remained linked. East Berliners who crossed into West Berlin via roads or railways automatically gained West German citizenship. From 1949 to 1961, about 3 million East Germans fled west, roughly 16% of its population. This exodus risked turning East Germany into an empty shell. The Soviet ambassador to East Germany explicitly called the situation critically unfavorable. Western powers also feared Soviet escalation, like seizing West Berlin. So when East Germany built the Berlin Wall in August 1961, Western reactions were nuanced. Public outrage, private pragmatism. Publicly, President Kennedy condemned it as a wall to keep their own people in, while privately admitting walls were better than war. Thus, the wall marked both the Cold War's peak and its essence. Not open combat, but separation. From Yugoslavia to Austria and Germany, plus NATO-adjacent neutral Finland and Sweden, buffer zones formed between blocs, minimizing military clashes. With European war risks contained, colonial liberation movements erupted beyond the continent. Since the 16th century, Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, and the Netherlands expanded globally through military dominance. Mid-20th century, liberation movements violently challenged Western colonial systems. France fought communist forces in Vietnam and guerrillas in Algeria, draining resources. From 1955 to 1957, France exhausted two-thirds of currency reserves, suppressing revolts, causing hyperinflation and deficits that forced retreat. First, France withdrew from Vietnam, then recognized Algeria's right to self-determination. Another colonial power, Britain, was also in turmoil. Soon after 284, it lost India, Pakistan, and Burma. The empire where the sun never set was no more. 1960 to 1964 marked the British Empire's darkest years. During those 4 years, 17 former colonies held independence ceremonies. British officials raced around lowering the Union Jack as new flags rose. The Western colonial system thus collapsed.
The author notes decolonization benefited Europe too. Without exploitable colonies, Western powers refocused on Europe.
Clearly, only by strengthening ties under peaceful order could Europe prosper again, making integration imperative. This forms Part 2's core, from Western Europe's prosperity to welfare states. European integration began in 1948 with the Benelux Treaty among Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. They eliminated tariffs, enabling free trade and financial flow. Later, even industrial and monetary policies became joint decisions. In 1952, Benelux nations joined France, Italy, and West Germany to form the European Coal and Steel Community, eliminating internal tariffs. In 1958, this upgraded to the European Economic Community, EEC, headquartered in Brussels. The EEC broke all trade barriers, enabling free movement of goods, labor, capital, and services. This integrated, fragmented Europe into a common market with remarkable impact. For example, German coal, vital for French industry, became cheaper without tariffs. Similarly, West Germany scrapped farm tariffs, allowing French agricultural products to flow freely. This boosted French agricultural development enormously. In a short period, France's butter production increased by 76%. Cheese exports rose by 116%. Barley output grew by 348%, and corn production even multiplied eightfold. For the first time in history, France became a major food exporter, and Germany's industry also regained its vigor. In 1950, West Germany held only 7.3% of the global industrial export market share, far below pre-War I levels. By 1960,
its share approached 20%, returning to pre-war Germany's peak level.
And over half of West Germany's manufactured goods were sold within Europe. In other words, European integration powerfully propelled Germany's economic recovery. Less developed regions benefited from the policy of free labor movement. According to statistics, from 1958 to 1970, this policy enabled around 40 million laborers to move across Western Europe, primarily from less developed to more developed regions. Italy alone sent 5 million workers to West Germany, helping Germany fill labor shortages while Italians increased their income. The money workers sent back could be used for economic development, creating a win-win situation. Increased income naturally boosted purchasing power. Take a small example. Nylon stockings were once considered a luxury in Europe. In 1950, West Germany sold only 900,000 pairs. But a few years later, sales reached 58 million pairs, a 64-fold increase. In 1961, France had only 49 supermarkets. 10 years later, that number grew to 1,833. In today's world, connecting consumer trends, Carrefour, the second largest retail group, rose during this period. Housewives buying large amounts of food from supermarkets needed storage, so refrigerator demand steadily climbed. In 1957, most Western European households didn't have refrigerators. By 1970, they became standard, and cars also entered ordinary homes. The French Renault 4CV and Italian Fiat 500 were both highly popular for their suitability as family cars. For the first time ever, bus ridership declined as more people drove private cars. Western Europe's economic boom made building welfare states possible. As mentioned last time, in the early post-war period, countries like Britain, France, and the Netherlands initially established welfare systems to protect people from unemployment and hunger. Of course, welfare levels were low initially due to limited resources, barely covering basic needs. With Western Europe's economic boom in the 1960s, increased government revenues naturally boosted welfare spending. Nordic kingdoms, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway saw the most astonishing welfare growth. Denmark and Sweden increased by 2.5 times, Norway tripled. Most funds went toward insurance, healthcare, pensions, education, and housing, creating comprehensive cradle-to-grave welfare states. This is quite fascinating. Historically, these nations were known for poverty, relying on forests, farms, fisheries, and minimal industry. Europe's periphery. In the 1930s, 1/3 of Sweden's workforce was unemployed, rising to 40% in Norway and Denmark. Post-war, Sweden pioneered comprehensive welfare for historical reasons. During the WAO, Sweden remained neutral, escaping Nazi invasion. Under Allied embargoes, Nazi Germany imported 40% of its vital pig iron from Sweden, paid in gold. This enabled Sweden to amass huge wealth and build an iron mining-centered industrial system. By 1970, Sweden's iron ore output equaled Britain, France, and West Germany combined. Simultaneously, Sweden developed other manufacturing, especially world-leading paper and shipping industries. Economic growth boosted revenue, enabling Sweden's welfare model. Private ownership creating wealth through capitalist production. The government then imposed high progressive taxes on the wealthy, redistributing wealth into transportation, communication, education, arts, and social security. Its success made the Swedish model Europe's welfare blueprint, widely emulated. Economic prosperity and comprehensive welfare made Western Europe thrive, seemingly healing WHO's wounds. The future seemed infinitely bright, but let's not forget, Europe isn't just the West. There's also Eastern Europe. So while the West revived and prospered, what was happening in Eastern Europe? Part 3. Successes and failures of Eastern Europe's reforms, where I'll detail their efforts. Western Europe's prosperity created invisible pressure on the Soviet bloc. As previously mentioned, after Stalin's death, new Soviet leader Khrushchev proposed peaceful coexistence and competition with the West, aiming to economically surpass rivals and demonstrate Soviet superiority. But now, the West was clearly ahead, making reforms imperative. Khrushchev's approach was political relaxation, granting Eastern European nations some autonomy. Economically, allowing flexible measures to improve living standards. First, political relaxation. In October 1956, Poland's Communist Party elected Gomulka, previously imprisoned by Stalin, as first secretary, while dismissing Soviet Marshal Rokossovsky as defense minister. This surprised Khrushchev, who flew to Warsaw and ordered Soviet troops to prepare. But after meeting Gomulka, he changed his mind. Because Gomulka assured him Poland wouldn't leave the Soviet sphere, only seeking more autonomy. After consideration, Khrushchev accepted this. From 1958, Soviet troops gradually withdrew from Eastern Europe to reframe relations as partnership rather than occupation. Political loosening enabled limited economic reforms across Eastern Europe. In Poland, Gomulka dissolved 80% of agricultural collectives to boost farmer incentives, reduced heavy industry investment, and redirected resources to light industry, partially correcting economic imbalances and improving living standards. Other nations followed. Admittedly, these relaxed policies improved livelihoods. People at least weren't starving. In better-off regions like East Germany, half of households had refrigerators, 2/3 owned TVs, nearing Western levels. A minority even owned cars. But reforms achieved little beyond this. Ultimately, as Soviet satellites, Eastern Europe couldn't leverage their resources, and the Cold War barred them from joining the EEC to share Western prosperity. By mid-1960s, limited reforms benefits faded, and Eastern Europe showed renewed decline. It's obvious that without changing the Soviet model, Eastern Europe's economy can't undergo qualitative changes. It can't sustain development. But how to change it is a big question. There's no word wrong. Right. Eastern European countries have roughly three approaches. The first can be summarized as reforming without angering the Soviet Union. Hungary is a typical example. Its leader Kadar assured the Soviet Union that Hungary's reforms were just to solve specific difficulties, not to abolish the Soviet model. In practice, Hungary abandoned the emphasis on heavy industry and no longer strictly enforced central planning. It also reformed public ownership under central planning. In 1968, Hungary officially introduced a new economic system. Some industries previously monopolized by the state were open to private capital. All enterprises had to operate independently, bear their own profits and losses, and commodity prices were determined by the market. Yes. More crucially, collective farms were given significant autonomy, and the government even encouraged land privatization, breaking through the Soviet model and yielding great economic benefits. And. The lives of Hungarian people improved significantly, but Kadar never relented, insisting he had not deviated from the Soviet model. The Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party, which he led, firmly controlled the domestic situation and obeyed Soviet orders, which reassured the Soviet Union. The second response was to distance from the Soviet Union and court the West, with Romania as its representative.
Romania was once a staunch ally of the Soviet Union, firmly siding with it in disputes with Yugoslavia and Albania.
However, after Nicolae Ceausescu became General Secretary of the Romanian Communist Party in 1965, Romania's foreign policy shifted. Ceausescu proposed so-called national communism, meaning Romania still practiced communism but prioritized national interests. Practices like the Soviet Union buying Romanian agricultural products at very low prices through Comecon had to change. From then on, it drastically reduced trade with Comecon and turned to Western countries for help. In 1967, Romania recognized West Germany. In August 1969, Nixon visited Romania, the first U.S. president to visit a communist country. And Nixon highly praised Ceausescu's distancing from the Soviet Union and gave him generous rewards. Soon after, Romania joined GATT, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, and also accepted trade preferences from the EEC. How did the Soviet Union feel about this? Simply put, displaced but tolerant, since Ceausescu never challenged Soviet ideology or withdrew from the Warsaw Pact and Concanon. Romania remained part of the Soviet bloc, with their interests deeply intertwined. Soviet leaders deemed this acceptable, but took a different stance toward Czechoslovakia because its actions crossed Moscow's red lines. For years, reform demands within Czechoslovakia had grown intense. In early 1967, Czechoslovakia's Communist Party attempted economic reforms. A year later, reformist Alexander Dubček became first secretary, accelerating changes. Central planning loosened, and enterprises gained autonomy. Agricultural reforms commenced. This resembled Hungary's reforms, but Dubček erred critically in two areas. First, permitting opposition parties to form and campaign. Second, demanding Warsaw Pact withdrawal. Soviet leader Brezhnev saw Czechoslovakia abandoning the bloc, an unforgivable offense. In August 1968, 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops invaded Czechoslovakia, toppling Dubček. And all of the fire... Actually, the Soviets had done this 12 years earlier. Back then, Hungary's government sought economic reforms and Warsaw Pact exit, treason in Soviet eyes. On November 4th, 1956, Soviet troops occupied Budapest within an hour, installing a new government. After this, Kadar implemented his cautious, non-provocative reform model. Czechoslovakia essentially repeated history, making Soviet intervention predictable. Moscow was drawing its line. Reforms were permissible, but escaping their orbit was not, though this came at a cost. The 1956 Hungarian uprising shattered the USSR's global image. The 1968 Czechoslovakia invasion nearly bankrupted its political credibility. Eastern Europeans resented this, while Western leftist parties suffered massive blows. Italy's Communist Party lost 400,000 members and never recovered. In France, Soviet defending leftist intellectuals like Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, and others began shifting their stance. Of course, this didn't mean Western Europe's leftist movements vanished entirely. In fact, leftist forces soon found a new direction, rallying youth to ignite a far-reaching revolutionary storm. Part 4. The young generation ignites a revolutionary storm. That's what I'll explore. Western European leftists linked Soviet intervention in Eastern Europe to imperialism, concluding the USSR had betrayed leftist ideals and wasn't worth aspiring to. Instead, early 20th century Marxists like German revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg, Hungarian philosopher Lukács, and Italian communist founder Gramsci had criticized the Soviet model early on. Their works now seem prescient and are widely read. Simultaneously, Marx's early works like Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844 and The German Ideology were reinterpreted, forming the New Left movement. And what's new about the New Left? Simply put, it criticizes both the USSR as imperialist and capitalism, with consumerism as capitalism's core target. New Left figure Herbert Marcuse, the German-American thinker, explained this. Marcuse argued modern capitalism exploits workers economically and narcotizes them through consumption and entertainment. When trapped endlessly pursuing materialism, people forget civil rights struggles and willingly accept exploitation. Consumerism's trap. This New Left critique didn't resonate with older generations who endured war and hardship. To them, consumerism meant enjoying hard-won comforts. But youth grew up surrounded by abundance. Baby formula and toys to records, TVs, and game consoles. Yet prolonged comfort bred emptiness and lack of purpose. Hence, youth embraced outrageous fashion, rock music, even marijuana, anything offering sensory stimulation and pleasure. Hearing New Left analysis, youth realized, oh, this is capitalism's conspiracy, using consumption to mask exploitation and crush resistance. This idea spread rapidly among young people, especially in France and Germany, with their leftist traditions where it was warmly embraced. At first, mainstream society didn't take it seriously, thinking young folks were just venting emotions and couldn't cause big trouble. But they miscalculated because times had changed, and the movement compressed on Boston. The author points out that traditional Europe only distinguished between kids and adults. Before leaving school, you were a kid. After working, you were an adult. No concept of youth in between. But after the war, special conditions in Europe made the youth group suddenly rise up. What were these conditions? During 2001, Europe lost tens of millions of people, and birth rates plummeted. After the war, birth rates rebounded, creating a baby boom. This shift made Western Europe's population structure younger. For example, in France, according to 1965 stats, people aged 14 to 24 exceeded 8 million, making up 16.1% of the population. More importantly, these folks significantly surpassed the older generation in economic power, education level, and social influence. They also emphasized individuality more and didn't want to be tied down by traditional norms. All this made young people a separate social group with serious power, something totally new. The New Left's main supporters were intellectuals like journalists, writers, and uni professors, who had huge sway over young folks, especially students. Marcuse, mentioned earlier, taught long-term in American universities and actively backed U.S. students' anti-Vietnam War activities. When his ideas spread back to Europe, they sparked intense reactions. He was hailed as a spiritual mentor for youth, leading to an interesting thing. The mainstream society, made up of the older generation, stayed conservative. Whether in Britain, Germany, or France, right-wing parties were in charge, while campus youth got more radical under New Left ideas, hating on mainstream society. To them, the older generation was outdated and hypocritical, yet used their power and resources to control youth. Totally unbearable, setting up generational conflict. And the trigger came in 1968. Starting in 1967, French uni students clashed with the Ministry of Education on many issues, with the fight focusing on dorm management. Under French uni rules back then, dorms strictly banned opposite-sex visitors. Students demanded more humane policies, but officials wouldn't budge, leading to huge arguments. In early 1968, at the newly opened swimming pool at Paris University's Nanterre campus, French Youth Minister François Missauf attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony. During the ceremony, a student named Daniel Cohn-Bendit challenged Missauf about the dorm dispute. As youth minister, why aren't you speaking up for young people? Missauf sneered. If you have sexual frustrations, you should jump in the pool to cool off. Cohn-Bendit retorted. Whoa, that's exactly how the Hitler Youth used to talk. Afterward, Paris University attempted to expel Cohn-Bendit for insulting an official, sparking continuous student protests. As one of the organizers, Cohn-Bendit saw the French government shut down Nanterre campus, prompting protesters to shift the movement to Paris University's main campus downtown, escalating the conflict. Even then, the French government remained oblivious. President de Gaulle and PM Pompidou believed the student movement would fade, thinking youthful energy burns out quickly. Little did they know they'd face the famous May 68 uprising.
On May 6, 1968, students clashed violently with police, hundreds injured, and 600 students arrested. Media coverage amplified the incident nationwide, drawing students from other cities to Paris to support their peers.
On May 12th, students occupied Paris University, building barricades around campus to resist police.
The next day, France's largest union called a general strike. Hundreds of thousands of Parisian workers marched. Then strikes spread nationwide, halting refineries, power plants, railways, and airports. By month's end, France neared paralysis.
Why did workers join in? Simple reason. Workers were mostly young too, sharing students' frustrations. Students opposed rigid university rules, just as workers hated dehumanizing factory policies. Students' anti-capitalist critiques also amplified workers' resentment toward management. This became clearer when May 68 spread to neighbors like Italy. Compared to other European nations, Italy industrialized later, especially its south, which only developed post-World War II. This made Italy's labor-capital conflicts peak in the late 1960s. Inspired by France's May 68, workers and students occupied Turin's Fiat factory in autumn 1969.
One factory after another was seized, naming this movement the Hot Autumn.
West Germany presented a different scene. Its youth targeted Chancellor Kurt Kiesinger because Kiesinger joined the Nazi Party during Hitler's rule, serving as deputy director of broadcasting under Goebbels. Post-war German governments avoided confronting this dark history, never fully purging fascists. So to older generations, Kiesinger's past wasn't a stain, but youth weren't so easily fooled. They believed all Germans bore responsibility for fascism. Ignorance was no excuse. Against this backdrop, Kiesinger as chancellor was glaringly problematic. Intellectuals like Günter Grass and Habermas launched sharp critiques, joined by hundreds of thousands of protesting students.
On November 7th, 1968, a young journalist rushed the stage and slapped Kiesinger during a speech, shouting, "Nazi, step down!"
This became known as Germany's echo of May 68, with mass protests in France, Italy, Germany, spreading to Britain, Netherlands, Belgium. 1968 became Europe's new year of revolution. But as the author notes, revolution is an overstatement. Protesters had no clear revolutionary agenda or actions, just strikes and marches. In some ways, it was protest for protest's sake. Thus, May 68 didn't change Western Europe's political systems or social structures. Government's cold shoulder tactics eventually calmed tensions. Still, impacts followed. De Gaulle and Kiesinger resigned disgracefully. Right-wing influence waned, making way for center-left governments across Western Europe. Only later did people realize this signaled the end of Western Europe's economic boom, prelude to 70s recession. This sets up Volume 3's narrative. All right, that concludes Volume 2 of Post-War Europe, Prosperity and Revolution. All right, I've wrapped up the interpretation of 1953 to 1971 for you. The reading notes are below the audio. See you next time.